All right, welcome back to the emergency goalies. We took an extra week off to let some more Blackhawks news filter in, and boy, did some more Blackhawks news filter in at the last minute. But I guess we'll start with that, the big news. We will get to the other Blackhawks moves that made earlier in this 2-week stretch, but Henry Jokiharju, who we talked about a lot our last episode, where he was going to fit in, and apparently the Blackhawks thought he fit best in Buffalo because they just traded him yesterday for former first-round pick from 2016, Alex Nylander, who is also the brother of William Nylander from the Maple Leafs and the nephew of the Blackhawks' former player, Michael Nylander. But I'll ask you, I guess we shouldn't be that shocked they trade Jokiharju, but it's still kind of surprising when it actually happened. So I'll ask you, Michael, what are your thoughts on the trade?
I really haven't decided yet. It's been a little while since I've actually gotten to watch Nylander, for more than, just a game here or there. I had studied him a little bit in his draft year. He's definitely a highly skilled player. Makes a lot of nice, quick passes. He has a nice release on his shot. He doesn't use his shot a ton, but I hope that's something that maybe he's improved upon over the last couple of years, maybe a little bit more willingness to shoot. The issue with Nylander is he's very much a perimeter player. He's not a guy that spends much, if any, time in front of the net. He's not a guy that is going to score dirty goals for you. He's going to have to score pretty goals or set guys up. Now, being a perimeter player does not necessarily mean that you cannot be successful, but it means you have to be really good at the skills that you have. And at least in his first couple of years as a pro, that really hasn't translated yet. But he's another right-handed shot, which is something that the Blackhawks have obviously targeted over this offseason. It was something that I harped on quite a bit last year. DeBrincat was the only guy that they had last year who offered any type of offensive ability as a right-handed shot. But then this offseason, we've seen them draft Kirby Dach. We've seen them sign Ryan Carpenter, and we've seen them trade for Andrew Shaw and now Nylander. And it's, this is definitely a risk. The other thing that the Blackhawks had targeted over the offseason and, was a stated goal of theirs was to get a little bit more grit into their lineup. Obviously, Shaw addresses that. I think they feel like Kubalik can contribute a little bit in that regard. Having Kajula for an entire season and then adding Carpenter, who can bring a little bit of that as well. All of those moves, along with the defensive moves of bringing in Dahan and Mata to a certain extent, we're all designed to help the Blackhawks both in front of their own net and in front of the opposing net. But as I said, Nylander is not that type of player. Yeah, this is more along the lines of a typical, a previous Blackhawks moves where they identify and go after skill above all. And
that's what I was going to add though too. Yeah, that's what I was going to add too. Is this move does strike a little bit of the same tone as the Dylan Strome trade last year, where it was a highly picked player who, some scouts are saying he had motivation issues and stuff. And, Strome was quite good for the Blackhawks last year. So I'm sure that's the hope with Nylander, because he had the same concerns where people are, does he give full effort all the time? And I don't know if I ever believe those, but those concerns are out there.
Yeah, and those type of concerns are legitimate with some players. I typically don't tend to believe other people's takes on that because I have different views on toughness and effectiveness than quite a few hockey fans, especially old school ones. Um, and so I'm willing to give Nylander the benefit of the doubt. But even when I watched him back in his draft year and that, he's definitely a guy that does his best work and prefers to stick to the perimeter. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he isn't tough. I mean, you still have to be able to fight off checks and through checks and be able to win some board battles. And we'll see if he's willing to do that. Just because he's not a guy that's going to stand in front of the net or, really drive the puck to the net with control, it doesn't necessarily mean, that he isn't tough. So we'll see. It's, the other end of this is, obviously the fans took a liking to Yoki Haru, with the complete disaster that the defense was last season. Obviously, Yoki Haru performed pretty well and definitely gave everyone some semblance of hope moving forward. However, I think I like Yoki Haru. I do think he's a very good bet to be a second pairing right-handed defenseman with a decent-ish shot to be a first pairing guy. I think it's far more likely he's a second pairing guy, but I do like him, and that's a very valuable asset. So it is definitely a questionable move if the questions about Nylander's motor and toughness are actually legitimate, but we'll see. Obviously the Blackhawks were dealing, obviously the defense as a whole is still a question, but the Hawks were still dealing from a position of strength in that they do have a deep right-handed defensive prospect core with Boquist and Ian Mitchell still both being available.
Well,
And obviously
that's
all
what
three
I
of
was
those
gonna
guys,
that's what I was gonna ask.
yeah,
So obviously they value Mitchell and Boquist above Yoki Haru now, would you say, or is that a stretch?
I don't know if it's above, but I do think they view Boquist above him for sure, and I think there's at least the chance that they view Mitchell as equal or perhaps better than Yoki Haru. All three of those guys, were projected to be top 4 caliber guys, so we knew all three of them weren't going to make it onto this roster. That was just never going to happen, and the Blackhawks were, heading into this year, they had a lot of good defensive prospects, not a lot of good forward prospects. And so, obviously adding Doc, was a big part, but, I think they felt like this was another opportunity to add another, former top 10 draft pick, the type of skill that's difficult to acquire outside of, having a high first round draft pick. So, is it going to work out? I mean, who knows? Strome worked out. Perlini hasn't so much. I mean, Perlini was I think he was the 12th overall pick. Obviously they picked up Cuckoo last year as well, who I think was like a 10th or 11th pick. So, some of these rolls of the dice work out, others don't. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. I don't mind taking risks on high-end talent, even if it is at the cost of a pretty good young player. It certainly seems like this is a deal where we're maybe sacrificing a little bit of probability to take a chance on some ceiling. So we'll see.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. It's I'm not going to denigrate Yoki Haru either, but I think sometimes this happens more with baseball even than hockey. But sometimes the prospect hype train gets going and it kind of gets, overblown. And I think some of the average fans out there were thinking that Yoki Haru was like a lock to be the next Duncan Keith. And I think sometimes that can get a little bit, not that Yoki Haru couldn't be a good player, but I think sometimes that gets inflated. So then the fan reaction is a little more outsized and because people were very upset on the internet last night.
Yeah. Well, and it does have the associations of Nylander has definitely been a disappointment, considering his draft position, and has kind of been that way for a year or so. Whereas Yoki Haru, kind of the discussion around him has been, he was a late first round draft pick who's kind of exceeded expectations. So the narrative on him is all positive and strong, at this point. Whereas, I their value's probably a lot closer than what people would imagine. But we'll see. And I think the other part of that was, I had mentioned, obviously the defense last year was so bad and that Yoki Haru offered some hope. But the other part of that is the Blackhawks have not drafted and developed top 4 defensemen since Nicholas Hjalmarsson. It has been a long time. And now whether or not Yoki Haru ends up being the best out of their crop of young defense prospects that they have, or if he ends up being the worst, regardless of where he is in that pecking order, he arrived on the scene first. And so he was the one that the fans were, could see and could cling to. And so I think that kind of added to his value as as an entity for fans. But
yeah,
we'll
and another,
see. I mean,
yeah.
I do have some questions on Yoki Haru. He does move pretty well. He moves the puck well. I'm not sure he's got, an elite shot where he's going to score many goals, but maybe he can be more of like a Duncan Keith where maybe scores 5 goals but gets a lot of assists. But my one concern with Yoki Haru is he's not a real big guy, and and I don't want to say that it's never going to happen, but there were definitely a lot of times where he was just physically not able to win board battles.
Yeah, he would get
and so,
pushed around a lot.
Yeah, and 19 years old, first time in the NHL, that's going to happen to basically everyone in that position. But I'm kind of wondering if part of the Blackhawks evaluation, and we know they do a lot of in-depth physical testing on these guys, I kind of wonder if the deciding factor for them on that was they felt like he was going to be out of the other guys that they have, that he might have the lower physical ceiling where he might not be able to hold up quite as well under certain scenarios than what those other guys project.
Yeah, so. I was also going to say that, the Blackhawks are also very aggressive. Like the start last season, I don't know if people even remember this, he was put on the top pairing with Duncan Keith, which was a very aggressive to start his career, and it did not last very long. And it was, everyone thought, well, they were so aggressive with him.
Either he played pretty well, and so I don't know that was such a an issue so much with him, where I think part of it too was people were like, oh, look how much Q played him, and then as soon as Colleton took over, he stopped playing as much. And I think a lot of that was you were changing systems in the middle of the year. Is the young guy going to pick up on that quite as quick? Perhaps not. Also, Connor Murphy was out at the beginning of the year. Once he returned, he was going to take somebody's spot. We know it wasn't going to be Seabrook. So Yoki Haru was kind of the, obvious sacrifice in that situation.
Yeah, which was, by the way, was a point you made last episode. was that you were saying
Yeah.
that Yokiharu probably would start in the minors because Murphy would be ready for the whole year, and then maybe he would get a couple weeks until Dahan came back, but he would be in the same situation as last year.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're going to have to see how this plays out. I tend to think that Buffalo probably ends up getting the better end of the deal. But if, there's certainly the possibility that the Blackhawks end up with the higher end player out of the two. So we'll see.
Yeah,
It's got to play out.
Yeah, you'd say right now you'd say 60-40 odds for Buffalo, but those odds leave a lot open to chance.
Yeah.
All right, so now we can move on to some of these other mini moves. I guess we can just go in chronological order. The free agent period, the Blackhawks signed Carpenter from Las Vegas, who is, you'd say, like a fourth line guy. Would that be a fair assumption?
He's a 12th, 13th forward. His role is basically going to probably get paired with David Kampf on the fourth line. With Camp as a left-handed guy who at times struggled in the face-off dot. Carpenter can play both center and right wing, just like Camp. So I have a feeling those two are going to kind of be interchangeable, and they'll hopefully be able to win enough defensive zone draws. They're not going to contribute a lot offensively. They're not going to be asked to contribute much offensively. Their job is going to be win a draw in the defensive zone, or if you don't win it, just try and get control of the puck, keep it out of the net, get it out, and get a line change. It's the role we've seen Marcus Kruger play. Kruger kind of did it on his own for a few years there.
I guess we should add to best of luck to Kruger, who's going to play in Europe.
Yeah. I think at this point in his career, that's probably the best fit for him. His skating deteriorated a little bit, and his strength a little bit too. I think once he had that wrist injury a couple of years ago, it's robbed him of whatever remaining offensive ability he had, and it made him struggle in the face-off dot, and he wasn't quite as effective after that. But yeah, so obviously you would like to have one guy that can kind of play that role. The Hawks don't really have that luxury right now, so I think it ends up kind of being a tag team between those two to replace Kruger. And my guess is that those two will be tasked with playing a big role on the penalty kill. That was one of the things that they brought up with Carpenter, was that he was, a fairly regular part of the Vegas penalty killing core. And so that's going to be his role. Win some faceoffs and compete as a penalty killer.
Yep, and of course, Kampf signed a 2-year, just mint-based cheap deal, so that wasn't a surprise.
Yeah, both him and Carpenter are making $1 million per year. They both signed multi-year deals. Kampf is at 2 years. Carpenter's at 3. Those are contracts that are below the amount that you can bury in the minor leagues without suffering cap ramifications. So those are both guys that, I think they're probably hoping one of them can maybe take another step and develop into being a reliable fourth line guy for the near future. But at the same time, the Hawks signed them for low enough where if some of their young players come on, these guys are replaceable. These are the guys that the Hawks are hoping to upgrade in the coming years. But in the meantime, we needed somebody to fill those roles.
Yeah. And I never even looked. Did they offer Perlini a contract, or?
They're still negotiating. He is probably seeking a bit more money than the Blackhawks are willing to invest in him at this point. I mean, Perlini does have some decent back of your hockey card numbers. He is a guy that has scored goals in the NHL. I want to say he had 18 goals or 19 goals for the Coyotes a couple of years ago, and even last year in what was a down year, he still ended up scoring like 11 or 12. So I mean, he has a skill in the NHL that tends to pay you, get you paid, and so I think with a lot of guys with his amount of game experience and goal scoring acumen, they tend to get a lot closer to $2 million than $1 million in restricted free agency. But with the shortcomings that we saw in Perlini's game and just the fact that he's not going to have a roster spot, dedicated for him, he's going to have to earn it. I don't think the Hawks are interested in paying him anywhere close to $2 million. So if he's not willing to come down, or if the Hawks can find a trade partner, I think there's a very good chance Perlini won't be here. But there's always a chance that they can still have it work out, and he can get another opportunity here. But as of right now, he's not on the roster. He is not signed.
Yeah. All right. So now, a move I actually kind of like. The Blackhawks signed Islanders goalie Robin Lehner to a 1-year deal, and I really like this move. I think he's very good for the Islanders last year, and I think he's a solid backup. Of course, now it moves Colin Delia back down to the AHL, but overall, I like the move.
Yeah, I love the move. We knew the Blackhawks were going to have a little bit of spare cap space this season, where it was money that they're going to need to have earmarked for the DeBrincat and Strome extensions next offseason. So they couldn't bring in anybody with that money that was going to extend into next season. So I think they were kind of looking for bargain hunting on the, somebody looking for a 1-year prove it deal on the free agent market, or maybe looking to acquire, a 1-year rental player in a trade and just try and get the best, player that they could in that situation. And, Robin Lehner fell into their laps. He's a guy that has a lot of documented off-field concerns, as far as he's a guy with some mental health issues that kind of plagued him early in his career and kind of kept him from being a consistent performer, and kept him from fulfilling his full potential, as they also led to some alcohol and addiction issues. But before last season, he seemed to, kind of own up to it and get the help that he needed. And, in some ways, it's kind of similar to the Scott Darling situation from a couple of years ago before he signed with the Blackhawks. Now, so I think with those concerns, I can understand why the Islanders and other teams were maybe not willing to go, multi-years with him. But he was actually a guy that, before the offseason started, he was a guy I thought, I would love, if nobody else is going to offer him, a suitable contract. The Blackhawks seem like a good team to, that could take advantage of that and hop in on it. But then I had saw some rumors that the Islanders were actually offering him a 2-year contract. And so I just kind of discarded the notion. But obviously that stuff came to fruition, and now I think it's great. It sets the Blackhawks up perfectly. He's going to be able to do what Ward wasn't able to do last year, which is offer a viable, talented starting goaltender as insurance for Corey Crawford. And if Crawford is healthy, at this point in their careers, Leonard is as talented, if not slightly more talented. So, you could certainly even see a 50-50 split between the two if both are healthy. So, and then it gives them in the next offseason, both Crawford and Leonard's contracts are going to be up. If Leonard has a good year, I honestly think that they could decide to move forward with him as their starter as opposed to Crawford and not lose anything.
Yeah, and as you were saying, another thing too is that it probably good for Colin Delia to get a full year in the AHL, to get seasoned and ready to go.
It's not going to hurt him at all.
Yeah.
Yep. And especially with, Crawford's still just as big of a question mark this year as he was last year. He had yet another concussion last year, and no, it didn't keep him out for as long, but anytime he takes anything off his mask, that question's going to linger. And so they needed a third guy that they could count on. And like I said, this it worked out perfectly for the Blackhawks. I'm really happy with the way that they honestly have the best goaltending depth maybe in the entire NHL at this point. You got a true 1A and 1B with Leonard and Crawford, and Delia is, while not overly proven, has shown flashes of some really good potential, starter potential even as a number 3. And then Kevin Lankinen, who kind of split duties in the AHL last year, had a really good World Championship tournament with Finland, and just kind of he's kind of set himself up as a another potential option for them. So they look 4 deep in goal this year, and that sets them up nicely given Crawford's concerns.
All right. So now we move on to the final move, which I'm kind of ambivalent on, but a lot of other people have kind of been more pro, and I haven't really talked to you about it, but the Blackhawks have reacquired their old friend Andrew Shaw for a series of draft picks, and he's back in the mix. So I think I'll just ask you, what do you think of the return of Andrew Shaw?
Good move. Good, solid move. Shaw has a little bit of wear and tear on him, a little bit of injury concerns. He's probably not a guy that you can count on for 82 games at this point, but with the cap going up the way it has over the last couple of years, his contract is all of a sudden very reasonable. He's got 3 years at $3.9 million left for a versatile forward that can play all 3 forward positions. Again, he's a right-handed guy, willing to do some of the dirty work, be an agitator, just a bunch of things that the Blackhawks have been missing really since he left. He's a really good fit for what the Blackhawks need. And the cost was very reasonable. It was, second and a third round draft pick, which is, important, but not excessive. I'd much rather have Shaw than a second and third round pick at this point. Especially if the Blackhawks are looking to, compete at a higher level, and those end up being, later second round and third round draft picks. So
yeah, and I shouldn't say that. When Shaw left, I didn't think it was the end of the world for the Blackhawks. Is what was always my theory.
No, and especially at the time with the contract that he was getting offered and that he was seeking, it just was never going to be financially viable for the Blackhawks at that time. But in the 2 years since then, like I said, the cap's gone up enough. The Blackhawks have cleared enough of the other dead weight off of their salary cap situation where they can afford this. I wouldn't even call it a luxury. It's just he's just a quality middle six player, and he's paid appropriately for that. So it's just a solid fit. Not a home run, but it's a solid fit.
Yeah. And as you were saying, the Blackhawks desperately lacked third and fourth line players last year. So to get a solid third line player is a good move.
Yeah, no, I think we talked at times last year. I think, what did I consider? They had like 8 legitimate NHL forwards for most of last year. And right now, I think they have 10 proven guys. And then they've got Kubalik, Nylander, Perlini, Sakura, Sorella, Doc, and a couple of other guys that all have NHL skills. We'll just see, hopefully they can figure out in those last 2 spots that hopefully 2 of them will, develop to the point this season where they can be relied upon. And they've filled out their depth to a far, far greater degree than they had last year.
So that's
both on offense and defense now.
Yeah. Well, since you kind of brought that up, I thought I would ask you that for our final thing, because you were kind of talking on Twitter too about Kirby Dach maybe having a shot to make the team this year out of camp. So I thought I'd ask you, what do you think? Think there's a good chance of that, or?
I think at the very least they're going to bring him to camp and give him a chance to earn his 9-game trial. They can keep him up in the NHL for 9 games without burning a year of his contract and still being able to send him back to junior if he's not ready. So there's not a lot of risk in keeping him around in that situation. The only way that it wouldn't work is if there are just clearly 13 other players that are better than him. So if he shows enough to at least get a look, they get a little bit of a leeway and a little bit of trial at the beginning of the year. And they can do the same with Adam Boqvist this year as well. I think both of those guys have a shot, where they could get a look, and then, the Hawks can play it by ear after the first month of the season. They could send them both back to juniors, or they could decide to keep them around if they're performing well.
Yeah, and that would be.
And then obviously Doc's odds would improve if the Hawks decide to trade Artem Anisimov. We're still not sure where the chips are going to fall on that. It's obviously a move that I think they would like to make, but they're not just going to dump him for nothing. I think they feel like they can still they need to get at least a decent return for him. They're not just going to treat him as a cap dump, I don't think. So if he's gone, that opens up a lot more opportunity for playing time at center on the Blackhawks roster. But if Anisimov is still around, it'd be a little bit harder to fit Dach in.
Yeah, so that'll be what we'll have to look for the next month or so to see if they find a taker for Anisimov, or I guess possibly for Perlini if they can't work out the terms for his restricted free agent deal.
I think Perlini, the odds of him being a part of the Blackhawks opening night roster are, I don't know, maybe 25% at this point, whereas I think Anisimov is probably closer to 75%.
Yeah.
And I apologize. My dog has been going nuts all night.
Yeah, it's okay. Everyone, the listeners of the podcast are familiar with your dog, and we don't mind. So I don't mind.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess that'll be where we'll end it for this week. Now, I don't know exactly when we'll be back the next time, but obviously, I mean, if Anisimov is traded or there's some other big move, we will come back with a. I mean, if there's another Yoki Haru style trade coming, then obviously we'll be back then, and we'll just play it by ear until then, because obviously the season When does the camp starts in end of September, right?
I think it's the middle of September is training
Okay.
camp. Is I think middle of September is when like the games start. But they got like their prospect camp starting next week, and then they'll have like their prospect tournament. I think is next month, and so there's a little bit of goings on and stuff. But I'm not sure any of it will require a full blown podcast episode for. But we can play it by ear, like you said.
Yep. All right. So that's it for this episode. I'm STH85 on Twitter. Michael?
MJ_Ernst.
Yep. Of course, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and give us a rating and a review if you like what you hear. You can also, I put up the links on Twitter so you can get it on SoundCloud. And yeah, we'll be back when as news merits. And until then, thank you for listening.